Hi guys and gals, and welcome to Magic. My name is Thomas Hansen and I'm one of the magicians over at IDE, and in this YouTube video I'm going to give you a guided tour of HyperIDE. So what is HyperIDE? Well, HyperIDE is actually a web-based integrated development environment, kind of like replacing Visual Studio VS Code if you like, although obviously not as feature-rich as neither of these traditional IDEs. It still does actually have a couple of really interesting traits that the other more traditional IDEs does not have. So here I have Magic. Let me log into my backend, at which point I'm given KPI charts and some statistics and information about my particular Magic server. Now if I expand the tools menu item here and I click HyperIDE, you will find HyperIDE, and if you want to, by the way, you can take some more room for your code as you're editing your code files. Now this is my file system, or my virtual file system if you wish, and obviously I can edit files, markdown files, hyperlambda files, TypeScript files, HTML files, whatever really. Now if I hold down my option key on my Mac and click M, then it's maximizing the code mirror editor. Now of course, as you're probably aware of if you have seen some of my previous videos, that these unique traits that HyperIDE actually has is its ability to actually automatically generate code for me without me actually having to do anything whatsoever. If you expand the menu here, the action bar, and click the codifier, you can actually choose any existing database you have, and it supports MySQL, PostgreSQL, MS SQL Server, etc., etc. At which point you can choose a database and you can go through one of your tables one at a time. You can configure them with authentication, authorization settings, public signal messages, etc., etc. And when you're done configuring everything, you just click Codify all tables, and some few seconds later, Magic has produced some 3,200 lines of code for you automatically, and you can immediately see the code here. Now, once you're editing your code, for the record, if you're on the Mac, you can hold down Function and Control while you click space. If you're on Windows, you can click Control space to get autocomplete. And this, of course, allows you to more easily see hyperlambda slots if you are editing hyperlambda files. You can get some similar types of autocomplete in TypeScript and HTML, but it's not as strong as the hyperlambda equivalent. So, and in fact, HyperIDE has a lot of shortcuts. It has Alt-M on Windows or Option-M on OS X to maximize the code mirror editor, like I'm doing here. It has stuff such as Alt-S to save, delete active file, close active file, rename active file, show autocomplete, etc., etc. Now, one feature that you probably haven't noticed about HyperIDE so far, which is probably a little bit under-communicated from us, is actually the Executor Macro. So what is a macro? Well, if the codifier is like the 100% automatically do everything for you, blah, 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 then the macro is kind of like its little brother, so to speak, if you wish. If you choose it, you can actually choose from any one of the pre-existing macros in the system. For instance, here I have a download file endpoint, here I have an upload file endpoint macro. If I choose my Sakila database, my Sakila module, as I'm clicking this guy, then by default it will choose the Sakila module, but I can also override it manually from within here. Here I supply authorization settings for this particular endpoint, and then I provide a name for my endpoint. And when I click execute here now, I actually have an upload file HTTP endpoint in my module. And actually we can see the code that Magic automatically generated for me. If we have a look at it down here, you will see upload file.put.hl. It's HTTP put verb. And here it takes a file and it actually automatically deletes a previous file if you're like overwriting an existing file. This is optional for the record. Here you can see it actually automatically creates a folder inside of my etc. folder called Sakila once I upload a file, and then it basically saves the file with a GUID randomly generated file name to ensure that I'm not overwriting other files which might have similar names before it actually returns that GUID to the caller like this, allowing the caller to do whatever it wants to do with that particular unique file name. So that's one feature. Another feature, obviously, is if I have an endpoint file here, such as this is my endpoint file that counts actors in my Sakila database, I can immediately invoke it like this. And I can also parameterize it. Here you can see I have 204 actors. I can also parameterize it. A%, which point it only counts actors whose first name starts out with the character A, etc., etc. So this allows me to have an extremely fluid software development model. And if you watch my previous video about how to create assumptions, then you will see the new assumption button here, allowing me to actually automatically generate a unit test, which is actually persisted and becomes part of my test suite, which I can run in its entirety through the assumptions menu item, which you will find underneath, I think it is analytics. Here you go, assumptions, right. So as you can see, Hyper IDE might not have all the features that Visual Studio, Rider, or PHP Storm, etc., has, but it has a couple of really unique, interesting features that neither of these other IDEs actually have. And of course, its most important feature, obviously, being it's 100% open source. So anyways, that was it for this YouTube video. There's a link in the description of this YouTube video to where you can actually download Magic and play around with it locally on your own development machine. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day.